On today's episode of Locked On Wild, if the Wild are looking to move up in the NHL draft, what do they have to offer in return?
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we discuss the options the Wild have if they wanted to move from 13 to higher up in the first round of the NHL draft. We'll take a look at draft picks, prospects, and a couple of other items that could potentially get them there. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and the Wilds currently sit at 13 in the NHL draft, at least in the first round. And with the current crop of prospects, would the Wild want to look at moving up further into the first round if they really have their eyes set on a player like Cole Yzerman, who in the latest Tankathon mock draft is projected to the Montreal Canadiens at 5. If the Wild wanted to move up to get somebody like that, if they had any player in general pegged in the first round that they wanted to go get, what can the Wild do to get there? Well, let's take a look at all of the different things that are on the table for the Minnesota Wild to do just that. We'll start in the draft picks department. In this upcoming draft, the Wild have a first, a second, a fourth, and 2 fifths and a sixth. The fifth round pick is from the Buffalo Sabres that they acquired in the Jordan Greenway trade. So a couple of rounds in which the Wild don't have their picks. Now, next year, the Wild have a first, a second, a third, a fourth, and a sixth. But then 2026 is the big one in which the Wild have a ton of capital to move, as they have a first, a second, 2 thirds, 2 fourths, 2 fifths, and 2 sixths, and also a seventh. So the big question becomes, what is it going to take to move up? Now, there are a couple of different spots that the Wild could look if they really wanted to make an impact. If they had somebody that they were looking at that they were like really enamored with, that they wanted to add to their prospect pool, you could move to, for instance, I have kind of pegged 6, 7, and 8 as kind of that a nice ground to jump up to be able to get a high impact player that you could add to your midst. The Utah to be named laters currently pick 6th, followed by the Ottawa Senators at 7th, and the Seattle Kraken at 8. And for those teams, they've got a sizable amount of talent already in their prospect pool. And especially in the case of the Ottawa Senators, they are a team that has just been continuously trying to put themselves in position for a playoff run. And with the talent that they have accumulated, they are going to be looking for players that can potentially help get them closer to that playoff goal. Seattle at 8 is a team that is just, I think, in this current iteration, they'll take whatever they can get. And with Utah, maybe they look to make a big splash playing in new digs after relocating from Arizona. Those are all possible teams. Montreal at 5. Feel like it's probably going to take a lot to pry that pick away. And then you have the Columbus Blue Jackets at 4, Anaheim at 3, Chicago at 2, and San Jose at 1. Those are all dicey propositions to try to make trades with because those teams are looking for those high impact type players to add to their roster. So it really does feel like 6, 7, and 8 is a spot that the Wild could definitely look to get to if they want to try to add more of a high impact player to their midst. So just looking at a couple of examples, we'll talk about some of the other trade chips. I'll actually go through the prospect pool for the Minnesota Wild just to kind of look at some of the guys that are untouchable and some of the players that could be available depending on what it would take. Was looking through some old trades just to try to get a sense of have other teams done this before? The Montreal Canadiens making a trade a couple of years ago, sending Alexander Romanov, a young defenseman, 24 years old, and not necessarily a points guy, but certainly brings it on the defensive side of the ice and has become a solid contributor for the Islanders since the trade. Romanov was traded with the 98th overall pick to the New York Islanders for the 13th overall pick. So 98 overall would be, I believe, a third round pick. And for the Montreal Canadiens there, that was a position where they were going and getting a pick and not having to give up a first. Like they gave up a player that was requisite enough to not have to give up a first round pick. And then they took that pick and sent it to Chicago for Kirby Dach. But the Canadiens grabbing the 13th overall pick for the 98th overall pick and Alexander Romanov. So one potential scenario that may be of interest to the teams in that area. Let's just say, for example, let's just go with Utah, for example. If you offer a third round pick, and I'm not necessarily saying Marco Rossi, but a prospect that is pretty close to being ready to go, that could become a solid contributor for the to be named laters, that'd be an easy way to grab a pick. Now, it'd probably have to be somewhere between. It would probably have to be more like a second round pick to jump up and get to the 6th overall. But it would be something that I think the Wild should, using that framework, should definitely consider. Because what is our overall objective here? Is to grab a high impact player that can be a bona fide top six at worst part of this Minnesota Wild roster going forward. So if you can do that while also keeping your current first, maybe that is worth Rossi in a second to send to Utah. And then all of a sudden you have the 6th and the 13th overall pick, and you have the opportunity to get not one, but two. You end up with Zeev Boyum or you end up with Cole Yzerman at 6, and you maybe grab one of those defensemen at 13. Currently, Anton Silyev, the 6'7" defenseman, pegged to the Wild at 13th overall in the Tankathon mock draft. So maybe that is a potential scenario in which the Wild explore to give themselves a couple of first-round picks if they are looking to indeed move Marco Rossi, but we also know that the Wild are looking for a player in return that could be, a comparable prospect in those conversations. So a lot of options. Let's take a look at some of the players that could potentially be available from a prospect standpoint. If the Wild are looking to make a move higher up in the draft or to accumulate an additional first-round pick, we will discuss as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, the NBA Finals are just about here. Unfortunately, for the Minnesota Timberwolves, looks like they will not be part of the NBA Finals, looking like Dallas and Boston as things wind up here in Game 5 as we are recording. But if you have always wanted to go to the NBA Finals but have not been able to because, let's be honest, those tickets get a little on the pricey side sometimes, Game Time can make getting to the NBA Finals a reality and make getting those tickets even faster and easier. Prices on Game Time on the Game Time app usually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. So, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to tune in for tomorrow's episode as we will be revisiting the 2000, 2001, and 2002 NHL drafts to see if the Minnesota Wild got the pick that they should have or if they could have upgraded over who they took in those first few drafts. So it was a fun episode to record. Look forward to that coming up for you tomorrow here on Locked On Wild. So I wanted to, we know the draft picks that are available for the Minnesota Wild. Let's talk about the prospects because there are a bunch of them in the system. And I think there are a few guys that I would define as absolutely untouchable. I think Danila Yurov and Jesper Wallstedt, I think, are clear untouchables in this Minnesota Wild prospect system. But some other guys that I would err on the side of caution in terms of trading. Obviously, one that comes to mind is Riley Heidt, who just continues to be traction towards him, not only getting that cup of tea at the start of the season, but also being on the roster longer than that, to the point that he may actually lock down a spot for the entire season, which would be amazing. So I would put him on the list of players that just are probably off limits for this Minnesota Wild prospect pool. Other players who I would lean towards not trading include the likes of Jack Peart. And I would also put in that mix probably Carson Lambos at this point. It's still too early to tell. And I know the entirety of the Iowa Wild roster basically had a disappointing season this past year, but I think it is still a little too early to tell whether or not those guys are not going to pan out or are going to pan out. But I would say your definitive absolute can't trades are those guys that are listed. Jesper, Danila Yurov, I will just say Carson Lambos, and probably Riley Heidt as well. There are a ton of other guys. So if it got to the point where Let's look at we looked at 6, 7, and 8 mostly, but another interesting team that is a few picks ahead of the Minnesota Wild is the New Jersey Devils at 10, who are currently pegged to select in this mock draft Berkeley Catton, a forward that we'll talk about here as we continue to ramp up our draft coverage. Berkeley Catton is another guy who has just a ton of upside offensively. And so if the Wild wanted to hop up to 13, there are some potential intriguing scenarios that could be in play there. Because you're only jumping up 3 spots. Again, this is assuming that you are just trying to jump up. That is a much smaller price to have to pay than jumping up, say, to 6. You could get by with, that may be a scenario in which you can take one of those 2026 picks and send that to the Devils and hop up from 13 to 10 at that point. But let's also keep in mind the Devils are one of the teams that we have mentioned as a real nice suitor for Filip Gustavsson's services. So would it be a situation in which you go Filip Gustavsson and maybe another draft pick for the 10th overall pick? Now that may not particularly even out, but there are options on the table for the Minnesota Wild if they want to get to 10 or to maybe even accumulate an additional first. Filip Gustavsson is definitely in play, and I would imagine the Devils are going to be a team that is pretty involved in that department. So that's another team I would highlight as a potential trade partner for the Minnesota Wild if they really want to hop up into the 10 range. And the Calgary Flames wouldn't be off limits either. Really, anybody from 10 all the way up to 6, I would think would definitely be in play for the Wild if they wanted to get to that point. And whether it be Filip Gustavsson, Marco Rossi to a lesser extent, because again, I think the Wild want to get substantive value for him in return. I think those would all be in play. And Bill Guerin is somebody as a GM who has a few things up his sleeve that we don't have, on the front burner. So there could be other players in play to try to get the Wilds either higher up in the first round or potentially adding an additional pick if they really wanted to go crazy with it and give themselves a ton of options. So those are, I think, the most likely scenarios. I don't think, barring some major trade, I don't think the Wild are going to go to 5 or above. So I think anywhere from 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, I think those are all in play. Utah, just to kind of recap, Utah, I think, will be looking to add more immediate impact players to help them get to the postseason because they're going to a new state and are going to be trying to get off to a good start there. They were in contention for a postseason spot through the first half of the season and then just fell off. Ottawa, same thing. Definitely in play. They're definitely looking for players that can help them now. Seattle, you could put them in the same boat, trying to get back to the postseason after missing out this year. Calgary is an interesting one because I think they're still a ways away. So that may be where a pick or a prospect comes into play to try to appeal to them. And then the New Jersey Devils, they are in need of some goaltending. So I think all of those teams are in play. And it's exciting to have all of those possibilities available if the Wild do really want to make a big splash. I want to finish tonight by saluting in a town in which championships have been few and far in between. Wanted to spend the final segment of the show today shouting out a team here in the state of hockey that brought home the inaugural title in their sport. So let's talk about PWHL Minnesota to finish things off here on today's episode of Locked on Wild. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to tune into tomorrow's episode where we'll talk with Isha Jerome of the Soda Pod about the 2000, 2001, and 2002 NHL drafts. And we'll take a look to see, did the Wild get it right? Did they get the players that they should have? And how did things pan out there? Those have been really fun. I hope you've enjoyed those looks back in the time machine over the last couple of weeks. We're going to continue. We're going to keep that going. And honestly, using the crossover with Isha, the weekly segment with Isha, to just kind of go into more fun topics, I think, because it's a lot more fun to have the back and forth. And then I can kind of take care of the the procedural stuff. But how about PWHL Minnesota taking care of business and winning the series against PWHL Boston to win the championship, and they brought the cup to Target Center as the celebration continues. It was an interesting run, and we're going to have Alexis Pearson on next week to talk about this a little bit more in depth. But an interesting run for PWHL Minnesota as they finished the regular season on a bit of a skid. They lost the final 5 games that they played in a row, and then went into the postseason. And that stipulation in the postseason that I just love is the top seed picking your opponent. So Toronto chose PWHL Minnesota. Toronto went up 2-0 in that series, and then Minnesota won the final 3 games of the series by scores of 2-0, 1-0, and 4-1 to put themselves in position for a chance in the final against Boston. Lost the first game of the series 4-3, but then came back with a 3-0 win. Won game 3 4-1. Lost game 4 in double overtime 1-0, and then the 3-0 win to finish it out and to do something that few teams in the history of Minnesota sports have done. We'll talk about the playoff demons and the demons in general for Minnesota sports for a special edition of Locked on Wilds coming up for you on Monday. But the thing that I like about how Minnesota took care of business in the final game was the fact that Minnesota was the aggressor. Minnesota was clearly putting themselves in position to take the game, to take the series, and to not sit back and just hope that nothing went wrong for them throughout the course of the game, and to hope that they could capitalize off of a mistake that their opponent made while also playing not to lose. That's a phrase that we've heard quite often here in Minnesota, is that it seems like Minnesota teams play not to lose as opposed to playing to win. Well, 44 shots for PWHL Minnesota to 17 for Boston, including a 19-3 edge in shots on goal in the third period alone. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how you close out a game, and that is how you close out a series, and that is how you play as a champion. And Liz Sheppers Michaela Kava and Kendall Coyne-Schofield with the goals. But you got to give some love to Nicole Hensley in net, 17 of 17 in net for PWHL Minnesota. And it all culminates in just a fantastic inaugural season for the PWHL. And it culminates in a Minnesota team being able to hoist a championship, something that has not happened on the men's side of things since 1991. There have been a couple of instances in which teams have gotten close, but by and large, it's just not a frequent occurrence here in this state. Minnesota Wild, in their history, have only ever gotten to the Western Conference Finals. That's the furthest they got, and they ran into the Ducks. They ran into a goaltender by the name of Jean-Sebastien Giguère, who gave up one goal in the series. Minnesota teams just do not get to this point. But State of Hockey, wear it with pride, because PWHL Minnesota is your champion for the season, and just a lot of fun to follow along throughout the season. And it's nice to be the first team to win the cup in the PWHL. So congratulations to everybody on the roster for helping contribute to that ultimate goal this year. And looking forward to the PWHL building off of this and continuing to add to the mix. So that was a lot of fun to watch. Wanted to give them a little bit of their due. We'll talk with Alexis Pearson next week about it in more detail. But as I had alluded to previously, Locked On Wild 2.0 is rapidly approaching. And basically what the ultimate goal of Locked On Wild 2.0 is going to be is to be a comprehensive content machine, to give you not only these full standard daily episodes, but forms of content that are unique and specific to all social media platforms, that give you kind of a full array of different bits, different questions, different things to give you the entire Minnesota Wild fan experience. So that is currently in the works at this very moment, and looking forward to that being revealed on June 8th, and really helping to take this thing to the next level. Locked On Wild, as it stands right now, is that I think the work speaks for itself as a show, but I would like to take it to an even higher level as we gear up for yet another season, because that's the whole part of how this works. Is you're always trying to raise the envelope, up the ante, and to just try to bring a little more to the table every time you get a chance to pull up to it. So keep an eye out for that. And if you have any suggestions about things that you would like to see, pieces that you would like to see taken care of on either a daily or a weekly basis, please let me know. LockedOnWild@gmail.com. We'll add in as much of your favorite types of content as we possibly can. So yeah, just wanted to update everybody on what is coming, and hopefully you are as excited for it as I am. That will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wilds. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to tune in for tomorrow's episode with Isha Jerome of the Soda Pod, and we'll talk about 2000, 2001, and the 2002 NHL drafts to see if the Minnesota Wild got it right, or if there were other players they could have selected that would have made more of an impact. Make sure to tune in on either YouTube or your favorite audio platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Locked On Wild has you covered every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.